In 1964, my grandfather and my uncle went on a camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains, which they had done countless times before. They hiked for about half a day until they reached a place we call the Devil's Bowl. In the Devil's Bowl, regardless of the time or day or night, it is darker than any part of the forest. No matter what season you pass through, there is no wildlife and no sound. It's a dead section of the woods, and when possible, they tried to avoid it. But they were losing daylight quickly. To make it to their destination before nightfall, they took a shortcut through the Devil's Bowl, a decision they would regret. They began to hear noises almost immediately, a branch breaking here, a rustling in the leaves there, and a clacking of rocks. By the time they reached the Devil's Bowl, surrounded by the dark forest that enveloped them like a blanket, they heard something pacing them step for step. My grandfather thought it was an old holler boy pretending to be a wood booger, trying to divert them away from their moonshine or marijuana grow, and he didn't pay it much mind. But the further they got, the louder and closer the noises became. First, little pebbles started bouncing off their rucksacks, and then the pebbles turned into larger rocks big enough to hurt if they got you in the right spot. At that point, they could see the outlines of something moving all around them. My grandfather pulled his pistol and chambered around, counting at least 5 of what he thought were people. As he watched them circling, he saw a big rock flying through the air, heading for my uncle's head. He pushed him out of the way and raised his pistol, and he shouted, "We're just passing through. We don't mean any harm." Before he even finished his sentence, a growl echoed through the bowl so loud it forced the air out of their lungs. These were no moonshiners, he realized. He looked at my uncle, who was pale as a sheet, and his eyes fixed over my grandfather's shoulder. He spun around, ready to take on whatever troublemaker was out there, but he was not prepared for what he saw. 10 yards away was a creature, 8 feet tall, built like a linebacker in a ghillie suit, only 3 times bigger. He had knotted black hair dangling off his body, and dark, piercing eyes that shone in the dim light and ripped through my grandfather's soul. His hands were all the way down about its knees, and he was swaying side to side, and his teeth were out like an angry dog. My grandfather yelled out again, "We don't mean you any harm. We're just passing through." He and my uncle locked arms, and they tried to leave. My grandfather trained his pistol on the beast in front of them. He began walking. The beast roared again, a deafening cross between a wampus cat, a grizzly bear, and Mama's howls when she was pissed off. My grandfather thought on his feet, and he roared back. Now, this was a big mistake. It only infuriated the creature, which began moving toward them. As my grandfather and uncle crested the rim of the bowl and reached the top, they realized they had walked into this creature's front yard. There was an igloo-like structure made of tree limbs and logs and sticks and leaves, and several sets of eyes were peering out. The creature started charging them, but my grandfather didn't want to shoot because it looked too much like a man. Instead, he shot above its head, but it only enraged the beast even more. It ran straight into them, sending them both flying. And when they landed, my grandfather jumped to his feet and ran over to cover my uncle, who was reaching for his pistol. He yelled at him not to shoot, but his words fell on deaf ears. My uncle rattled off 6 shots, the rounds tearing through the center of the beast, all 6 shots finding their mark. The click of the pistol's hammer slapping the backs of the spent rounds as my uncle frantically squeezed the trigger over and over. The creature collapsed, and all hell broke loose. There were creatures coming from every direction, running full force at them. The earth shook, the roars and screams and bellows cracked through the forest, setting off alarm bells to any other creature in the valley. My grandfather fired a shot in the air over another beast's head that was down on all fours, running straight for them. The animal veered off to the right, down over the hill. My grandfather spun around and saw another one charging. It knocked him off his feet before he could react and broke his ribs as it collided with him. He hit the ground and then staggered over to my uncle, who was covered in blood and slash marks on his face and chest. They made it to their feet again as the beasts started to surround them. One of them charged my grandfather, sending him crashing to the ground. Another slammed into my uncle, sending him flying in the opposite direction. That's when he realized, only then, that there was no possible way to make it out without fighting back. And he got up and found my uncle, thinking he was dead, dodging rocks and branches flying through the air as he reached him. My uncle wasn't moving. He was bloody and battered, and it ignited something in my grandfather, who spun around and fired around right into the head of the creature closest to him. The howling and screaming intensified. My grandfather started dragging my uncle to the base of an old hickory tree, smacking him, trying to bring him around, while digging through his pockets for his handkerchief. He tied it around the deep cut in my uncle's forearm and then checked how much ammunition he had, knowing he would have to shoot his way out. Another one of the beasts charged him. My grandfather fired at it, making it fall and crumble into a ball at the base of a tree. Two more creatures charged from opposite directions, dropping down to all fours and springing from side to side. They were closing fast. My grandfather was all adrenaline at the moment. He squeezed the trigger, whipped around and shot again, neutralizing both threats. The forest went quiet. If there were more beasts, they weren't making themselves known. He began to drag my uncle to his feet, his ribs searing with pain, and thinking to himself that he had killed the entire group and that he could be responsible for wiping out an entire species. They managed to make it back to the house, where my grandmother tended to their wounds. I could still remember the pain and sorrow in my grandfather's eyes as he recalled his encounter to me. He said he wanted to return to that area to apologize and see if the species had lived on, but he knew that was not an option. If any of them were still alive, they would have certainly killed him for what he did. My uncle never talked about it. He had scars on his chest and he rarely wore a short-sleeved shirt. My father told me not to ask him about it and said it happened in the war. He passed away when I was 12 years old after battling a lifelong alcohol and a drug addiction. I don't know whether he was trying to escape the events of the Devil's Bowl or for another reason. My grandfather died when I was 18. He was an honest man. He fought in the Korean War and he worked in the coal mines for 47 years. He never missed a day's work and was always busy fixing things up or finishing projects that couldn't wait for tomorrow. He was a true mountain of a man and one of the best men that I've ever known in my life. In October of 2019, I had just finished my shift at a local farm with over 150 milking cows. When I was done, I locked up the place and I headed for my car. I was annoyed knowing I would have to lock the chickens away in their coops in the darkness. We kept them on the field across the road from our house, which was fine and spacious during the day, but at night it could be difficult because there were no lights. I climbed in my car and I rang my mother to let her know that I was on the way home. I set off driving through the rural villages, all of their lights glowing from behind closed curtains. I turned onto a long, straight but bumpy road and slammed on my brakes. A large black animal darted in front of my car, and it leapt across a small ditch and it vanished into the night. It had a round head, it had green eyes and a long, slender tail. I got out and used the flashlight on my phone to see over the ditch, hoping to get a look at it, but the woods were dark and silent, and the creature was long gone. My mind started racing, and I rushed back to my car and I locked the door and I sat there for a few minutes trying to figure out what I had seen. I ruled out the badgers and the foxes and deer and wild boars and any other animal I could come up with, and I knew it was far too long and tall to be a dog. I started thinking of some British cryptids I had heard about, and I realized I had seen the beast of Exmoor. I had heard stories of these large felines said to roam the country, killing livestock. I remembered seeing some rather blurry photos, but I had never given them any serious thought until that moment. I rang my mother immediately and I told her what I saw. She was shocked and she asked if I was okay. My dad wasn't quite convinced, nor was my little sister. When I got home, I locked the chickens up as fast as I could, worried the beast was out there watching me. The next morning at work, I mentioned it to my boss and some of my fellow workers, who looked at me like I was losing it. I knew then how most Bigfoot witnesses must feel. I kept the story to myself for a while after that, but I'm sharing it now because who cares what anybody thinks? You don't know me anyway. I know what I saw and no one can tell me different. If I ever make it over to the United States and I see a Bigfoot, I'll let only you know. I'm going to drop a couple of archive stories from years ago that I'm pulling up from the vault. Hope you guys enjoy it. The year was 2003 and I was living in a small town in North Carolina. I lived in a modest brick home in a somewhat secluded area in a heavily wooded area in Iredell County. My closest neighbor was 200 yards away through a small patch of pine trees. Everywhere else was older hardwood trees and 2 cornfields directly across the road from my house. White-tailed deer were abundant, and almost every evening they would come and feed at the edge of the fields. I made it a habit to sit on my porch and watch the deer before dark most evenings. Twice I remember the deer getting spooked and scrambling across the field after hearing an extremely loud sound that I can only describe as part moan and part scream. I remember wondering if mountain lions were in this part of the country. My nearest neighbor was a few years older than me and had a beautiful 100-year-old Victorian-style farmhouse that was situated on 15 acres beside my land. His name was James, and he had recently gotten out of the military. We were pretty close friends as I had always taken care of his animals and property when he was away, and he always returned the favor for me when I had to leave town for work. James called on a Saturday afternoon and asked if I wanted to do some target shooting with my new air rifle. I said of course, squirrel season was coming up. James had an old barn directly across the road from his house. The barn was approximately 70 yards from his front porch. We hung an old cast iron frying pan from a tree that overhung a four-wheeler trail beside the barn. This was usually used for our .22 rifles, but we thought it might be fun to try air rifles. It was early October and I walked over to his house at about 5 o'clock that Saturday evening. We took turns shooting at the frying pan, and after dialing in the scope, it proved to be an easy task to make it ring pretty loud with each shot. I had just made it ding 3 times in a row and had the rifle in my lap when we heard it ding again. James looked at me and I looked at him, trying to figure out what was going on. It dinged 3 times and stopped. James took his rifle and shot and dinged it twice. He rested the rifle on his knee and the pan dinged twice. It was starting to get dark and James says someone was messing with us. He went in the house and came back with a huge battery-powered spotlight. He said, "Let's go find out who's in the woods messing with us." We crossed the road and he shined the light into the edge of the woods where the trail started and the pan was hanging, but we didn't see anything. He yelled out, "Who's there?" and we heard limbs crunching about 20 yards to the right of the trail. He spun the light over where the sound came from, and we both saw eye shine that was impossibly large and at least 7 feet in the air. It was then that we heard, no, we felt a really low, menacing growl that vibrated into our chests. It felt like a jake brake on an 18-wheeler rattling my insides. James looked at me, and we both decided we needed the safety of his porch. The next day, he went to the frying pan and found several smooth rocks on the ground beneath our target that had to have come from the creek that was a quarter-mile down in the woods. I guess Sasquatch liked target practice too. I lived there until 2014, and I never forgot that experience. Only once after the pan incident do I remember hearing a strange, laughing-type howl late one night. It feels good to finally tell my story. I'm sure I'm not the only one in North Carolina who has heard these creatures. Thanks again for letting me get this off my chest. I had hoped it would be forgotten, but I will never forget that growl that shook my bones. All right, this story is pretty good. It's pretty good. I'm going to read the first paragraph of the man's email to me, and I'm going to talk about that for a minute. And then we're going to get right into a story, and it's a good story. He's a pretty good writer. But here's his first paragraph. I find your videos informative. Let me clarify that. It seems to me that when one or more has an equal interest in a similar topic and they connect, it becomes more than just informative. It becomes almost entertaining, and we look forward to seeing what will come next. And by that, I do not mean Throne of Games or those types of fiction. I think he meant Game of Thrones. Some people will never grasp the idea that we don't need to be entertained with deceptive fiction. Entertainment, according to Hollywood, does not necessarily mean having the truth involved, which is sad for everyone as far as I'm concerned. Okay, here's what I think he means by deceptive fiction. I don't think he's against fiction because he mentions fiction like the Game of Thrones. He's talking about deceptive fiction. And if someone sends me a story, and I think this is what he's talking about, and it's not true, it's just a story they made up, that's not fiction. That's a lie. That's misrepresenting something they've sent me, and that's something that I have no defense against. And I know, as sure as the sky is blue, well, it's kind of gray right now, that I have gotten stories that I know are just made up. Those are not fictional stories. Those are lies. Those are just things people made up and they sent to me. And by the way, those are the people that usually send them to me and every other channel that does this kind of thing at the same time. We've run into that before. But those are lies. They're not. These are things people obviously have a lot of time to do, and they have a lot of time on their hands, and they spend time writing a story and they present it as if it happened to them. And I don't know if that gives them some sort of ego boost or self-esteem boost or whatever it is, but they're not fiction, they're lies. There have been some on this channel, and there's no way for me to know. And so I treat every story like it's, heartfelt and it actually happened, because I could throw them out, the ones that sound kind of crazy, but Bigfoot is a crazy topic, and so you just don't know. And so I just go through and I read them all. Now, whenever I do fiction or have done fiction, and I haven't done anything fiction in a year on this channel, I did do some. I let some kids write fictional stories, and I read those, and people absolutely freaked out about that, and I'll never understand it. But I got a comment the other day from someone on one of those old videos, and the comment went something like this: I don't think parents should encourage their children to write made-up stories about Bigfoot. I think he called it demonic. And my reply was just another comment from an illiterate, and I meant that. Because if you don't understand the difference between a story that's made up and a lie and actual true fiction, then you are illiterate. You don't know what you're talking about. And I thought about his statement and I thought, what is it about a fictional story that gets people so riled up? I wonder if, and let me just list off 3 or 4 here that pop in my head. I wonder if Herman Melville's parents had been that way and told him to never write anything that he thought was made up because it's demonic. Because if they had, Moby Dick would have never been written. And Moby Dick is a fictional story, Captain Ahab and Queequeg. It's a great, great story. But it's actually fashioned after true events. I can't remember who wrote the historical narrative just recently in recent history called Into the Heart of the Sea. It became a movie. The Thor guy played the lead character and it's a great movie. That's the true story, but even the movie is quite embellished on how they dealt with the whale. But fiction is a great way to convey stories. How would it have gone if Jack London's parents had told him not to make up stories because it's demonic? We would have never gotten Call of the Wild or The Sea Wolf or any of the other great stories that Jack London wrote. What about if Joseph Conrad's parents had said that? We would have never got Heart of Darkness and all the other stories that he wrote. Wait, I think Joseph Conrad wrote A Sea Wolf. But anyway, we would have never got A Heart of Darkness, which means we would have never gotten the movie Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Sheen and all those guys, because that story was fashioned after The Heart of Darkness written by Joseph Conrad in the 19th century. What if J.R. Tolkien's parents had said that? We would have never gotten The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. And even more recently, and I'll stop listing them off, but these are the things that run through my mind. What if Peter Benchley's parents had said that? We would have never got Jaws. What would the world be like without Jaws? The movie and the book Jaws. So get off your high horse on this fiction thing and relax and know that these stories that I share, I don't know if they're true or not, and I've always said that, but I don't throw them out. I actually have thrown a couple out. They were so outrageous that there's no way they could be true, but there's only about 2 or 3. But other than that, there's hundreds of stories that we've done, and there's no way to know if they're true or not, but they are great stories. And the people who wrote them, if they made them up, they have to live with that, not us. We just get to enjoy the story. Okay. All right, I know that was long, and I know probably everybody's clicked away, but sometimes things get on my mind, and I have to talk about them. So let me go on and read the rest of his story, and it's a very good story, and I don't think the man, his name is Patrick, I don't think he is at all being critical of me and my channel for presenting fiction in the first year and a half I had this channel, because he did reference the Game of Thrones, and I never did that. Now, on my What If It's True podcast, I do all kind of fiction. That's my fun channel. And I tell everybody it's fiction. And I don't want to catch any blowback on that because it wouldn't be fair. But here's what Patrick writes. My wife is full-blooded Navajo, and I'm third-generation Irish descendant. Married to her for 23 years now. We met at the Navajo National Monument as park rangers in 1995. She grew up nearby, only 6 miles away from the National Monument. I was working as a ranger that same summer that we met. I'm going to relate an encounter I had back in 1986 in a state forest along the western side of mid-Michigan. It was near Muskegon, near a smaller community named Ravana, R-E-V-A-N-N-A, Ravanya. I'm sure I'm saying it wrong. It was late fall, and I had just finished a seasonal position working for the Grand Hotel in Mackinac Island. I was in good condition after running up and down the stairs at this large Victorian-era hotel. I was visiting a young love interest in Ravenna. Her cousins and uncles needed my help to gather firewood left in the forest. I worked with a medium effort. As I said, I was in great shape. I was to stay put in a designated area while the fellows went to take the tractor and trailer, loaded with wood, back to the yard. As I enjoyed the autumn sunshine afternoon warmth, I suddenly heard a loud tree knock close to me. I picked up a baseball bat-sized branch of oak nearby, and I proceeded to do a Ted Williams swing at the tree in front of me. The noise was loud when I connected, and at the end of the branch, it snapped off. It rattled my hands pretty good, too. I looked over and I saw that there was a hollowed-out part of a large diameter tree where fire or lightning had made its mark. I was 6 foot tall and weighed 170 pounds, and I was able to slip inside the tree and lean back with the sun on my face, warming me as the sun began to get lower now. I'm not sure to this day why I did that, but a couple of minutes went by and I caught a really horrid smell of skunk and urine. Very strong indeed. It was eye-watering, really. And then I heard some rustling outside of the trees. Leaves were being crunched down, and I sat tight. I heard the rustling again and poked my face through the oval slit from the tree. I did not see anything right away, but I did hear a very low gruff. It was a low chuckle or a laugh, as if someone was amused. I jumped out of the tree expecting to see my cousins or uncles to give them a scare, but I was still alone, and again I heard rustling in the brush nearby. The cold gave me a shiver. It was nearly dark now, maybe 5 minutes of light left. I made the call to head back to find the others. Jason, one of the cousins, was near me as I slowly made my way through the saplings. As we met up, Jason and I walked back to the truck, and I asked Jason if he heard the tree knocks often in this area. He said they were frequent in this part of the forest. Well, it was nearly dark now, and I could see that Jason was unnerved. He was spooked somehow. He then said, "Did you see those guys that are over there? They have hoods on up on their jackets." And he pointed to a small clearing with a thick stand of maple saplings. With the taller pines in the backdrop and the darkness looming, I saw the outline of the hooded guys walking away, with the slightly orange-lit horizon behind them, and they moved into the thickest part of the forest in a single file. I could barely see, with the light nearly gone from the setting sun, but I could see one looking at me as they walked away, as its body was turned towards me, and when I made eye contact, he turned and looked forward. These guys were tall. They were very big. They were like 8 feet tall. We drove the truck back to the large farmhouse, and we met up with my love interest and her extended family while we unloaded the wood. I was introduced to Jason's aunt and uncle, very friendly people. I told them about the tree knocks I heard, and I asked if they knew what they meant. This woman's eyes got real big. She looked at the uncle as if she wanted him to answer. He told me that they didn't talk about this to many people because ridicule would soon follow. The aunt smiled at me as I told them about the tree knock and the tree cave that I was in and the horrendous smell. The uncle said, "Yep, you got them to come in and take a peek at you for sure." I knew then and there that I was going to be on the lookout for anything like that in the forest for the rest of my life. The Sasquatch do exist. I suspect these are differentiations of Neanderthals or humans. The area in Michigan around Muskegon, Ravina, and Ludington were remote areas in the 80s. I think it was a migration route that they used. In the spring of 2014, my wife and I were traveling to Flaming Gorge, Wyoming for a short vacation. We decided to stop at a pull-off area called Moose Pond. It had picnic tables and outhouses available, as well as a paved trail that led around a small lake. It was at the base of the mountains where the large ponderosa pines took over. While I walked near the lake, I saw a dead rainbow trout. It was belly up and floating in the aqua blue water. I continued to walk the path all the way around the lake, and then I heard a distinctive sound of children laughing, like at a playground. It came from the tree line, and I felt eyes watching my every move. I heard it briefly one more time before we left, and as we drove away, I recalled someone mentioning to me that they had heard the very same thing at an encounter with a Sasquatch family. I instantly knew what I had just heard, and I told my wife, and she had heard it too. She was excited and said she believed it had been the big creatures. We live in a remote area now, and my dogs often bark at coyotes and wild mustangs. However, there are times when they bark violently and then they cower and hide. These creatures are swift, and they know stealth tactics that Army Rangers can only dream of. These guys are real pros in the bush, and they've had a very long time to dial in their craft. The stories of Sasquatch attacking native tribes throughout history and full-on battles with these creatures are real. They are still attacking us, grabbing our children, elderly, even our strongest and smartest that are naive enough to believe they are completely safe in the forests of North America. Make no mistake, some of the creatures don't give a hoot about your human rights. You may very well be the main course if there are no elk in the area. Maybe somewhere in between humanity, where not all humans are fuzzy, warm creatures, good experiences of life can still happen. Some of humanity's outlooks are brutal, and it can be sensed. We need to look closer within ourselves before we decide whether these things are just trying to survive the best they can as we encroach on their habitat. I, for one, did not see them as any sort of threat. They were amused at my antics, and they showed me a sense of humor. I can work with that. Perhaps someday I'll do some stand-up comedy routines in the forest to get them howling with laughter. And he signs off Patrick. And some of what that last paragraph, I don't fully understand, but there's some things people write I don't follow. It's not that they, if they were sitting across from me and we were talking, I could say, well, what do you mean about this? And they would explain it, and then I would understand. But sometimes I hate making assumptions, I don't want to take what a writer says sometimes and just, make an assumption if it's wrong. You don't want to be wrong about those things and then make a judgment on someone. Patrick, this was a great letter, and I'm very glad you wrote it. And these are really cool experiences, and we appreciate you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining me on this podcast once again. I really appreciate everyone who's listened this far. I'll be putting out another podcast early next week, so until then, hope you guys have a good week. Hope you've had a good Thanksgiving weekend, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.